Thank you. I think. I have to start this evening with a big apology because I am here under slightly false pretenses, I think. I'm not a church historian, I'm not any sort of historian, and kind of the odd one out, I think, on the slate of speakers for this conference. Well, no, not in terms of academic discipline, but just in terms of where I'm going to go. So, thank you very much for inviting me to speak, despite the qualifications which I have, which don't actually qualify me to speak here. One of the perils of working in a cross-disciplinary way is that I genuinely do find it very difficult to say exactly what I am in terms of the academy. If I'm not a historian, am I a moral theologian? Or am I an ecclesiologist? Or perhaps an epistemologist? Or all of the above, jack of all trades and master of none. I was going to say I'm a bit of a maverick, and then I realised that the Tom Cruise comparisons would let me down badly there. Well, I'm going to start with the sort of epistemology side of things, dipping briefly into the philosophy of knowledge, which I know is probably not exactly what you were expecting, and which I'm also keenly aware is pretty ambitious in this graveyard slot between two different possibilities of refreshment. So I will keep this bit as short as possible. But in order to address my title, I really do need to begin by giving some sort of answer to the question, what does it mean to make sense? As well as defining my terms of tradition and narrative. We've already had an interesting dose of defining of tradition, which is very relevant to what I've got to say as well. So first, what do we mean when we say that something makes sense? How do we judge whether anything makes sense? Generally, of course, we make that judgment without consciously thinking about it at all. We subconsciously interpret the world around us all the time. We understand our conversations, most of the time at least, without actually being aware of applying syntax and grammar to the stream of words that we're engaged with. We take our ability to make the judgment about what makes sense so much for granted that if we actually think about it at all, most of the time we would instinctively say that we instinctively make sense of things. It's just what happens. This is sitting on the floor. I don't have to think about why it's sitting on the floor. I don't have a reason that I can use it because it's being held on the floor by a certain force and the paper's going to sit on it, etc. We just instinctively know. But as we speak, as we act, and as we look at our environment around us and try and make it intelligible to ourselves, we do so by reasoning. And we don't bring our ability to reason to bear only when we consciously have to stop and think about things. We do it all the time. And we use practical reasoning, reasoning that takes into account contingent circumstances and makes them intelligible. The contrast is with the area of reasoning that most of us gratefully leave to pure mathematicians and logicians, pure reasoning. And if that sounds a bit Kantian, then yes, it is. So we leave that to one side because that's where it belongs. But all of us use practical reasoning pretty much all the time, certainly when we're awake. And we can see that most clearly, and this is close to home because my mother-in-law is in this position. We can see that most clearly when practical reasoning fails. So, for example, when someone with stage 4 dementia can no longer make sense of their intentions, their environment, and their interactions with other people. And they can no longer make sense of it because they can no longer reason from cause to effect. Now, some or all of you may feel that is actually just a statement of the obvious, but I think it needs to be said because Reasoning from cause to effect applies just as much to making sense of institutions and organisations as it does to our individual lives. And it needs to be said because some things in every institution or organisation do make no sense to outsiders, and that I think is especially true of the church, and it may even be especially true of the URC. And in almost every institution or organisation, there are probably some things that don't make sense to everyone who is an insider either. And from that, it has been argued that institutions like the church simply don't need to make sense in that practically reasoned way. That it is in fact a false move to try and apply the test of practical reasoning to faith-based organisations. Yet, practical reasoning is our only test of common intelligibility. It is the only way that we, as God's human creation, can actually have a shared understanding of anything by reasoning from cause to effect. We may disagree in where our reasoning takes us and thereby produce different interpretations of the world around us, but without practical reasoning we cannot make anything intelligible to ourselves or to each other. So even when we experience the movement of the Spirit, even when we say that we are guided by revelation rather than by reason, tradition or experience, even then we are still reliant on practical reasoning simply in order to communicate intelligibly with each other. So we can tell whether something is intelligible, whether it makes sense, by applying our powers of practical reasoning. And we do that all the time, moment by moment. But like human beings, institutions and organisations don't just exist in the moment. They persist over time, and so that's where the categories of narrative and tradition come into play. And in bringing those terms to bear, I'm following the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, best known for his seminal work After Virtue, first published in 1981, and his revival of Aristotelian ethics in a contemporary form, though for my current purpose it's his theory of meaning that is actually of interest, not his ethics. MacIntyre identifies narrative and tradition as being the keys to a proper understanding of knowledge and truth. And again, at the risk of stating the obvious, knowledge and truth are kind of important in making sense of anything. Now, there is a whole philosophy of the mind that we could explore here, but I'm going to swerve very smartly around that rabbit hole and stay focused on the questions which MacIntyre examines about behaviour and intentionality in the context of tradition and narrative. He argues that we make sense of the world around us and our own and others' actions by at least implicitly invoking two kinds of contexts. And this is typical MacIntyre speak. The role or effectiveness of those actions in the context of the history of the agent whose actions they are, and the impact they have on the setting in which those actions occur. And yes, with MacIntyre you do need sometimes consciously to reach for grammar and syntax to work out what's going on. So let me try and put that in simpler and possibly indeed oversimplified terms. Actions have to be interpreted and evaluated in terms of how they correlate with the previous actions of the individual or community which acts, and also how those current actions further the purposes of that individual or community. So they have to be interpreted looking backwards and looking to the future as well as in the moment. And MacIntyre calls that the narrative. And what about tradition then? Well, as Jean was talking to us about earlier, she had a definition of tradition. I think this is right. A habitual performance of social memory to create a continuity of identity for the community. I think that's right, yeah. So MacIntyre is very close, it's in the same ballpark at least as that. So we do probably instinctively tend to think of tradition as something which just carries a piece of history. For example, the pageantry of the Jubilee, or traditional service versus contemporary worship, Book of Common Prayer versus ASB, and family traditions, of course. Food, decorations and board games at Christmas, not of any great moment or significance, but all carrying with them a little bit of history that means something to us, even if the reason that we do it has actually disappeared. But McIntyre suggests that tradition is much more than that. Properly understood, it's something which actually has its own life, and which both shapes and continues to be shaped by individual and collective narratives, understood as the stories, intentions and desires of an individual or a community. So his words again. A living tradition is an historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely in part about the goods which constitute that tradition. Translated in something nearer to English, we can't isolate our behaviour, intentions and desires from our socio-historic context, because it's only in that context that they actually are intelligible. Without that context, our behaviour, intentions and desires do not make sense to us or to others. Right, more than time, you'll be glad to hear for me to turn not completely away from philosophy, but at least very firmly in the direction of the URC. And the question which immediately arises from that sort of philosophical overture must be whether there is evidence of unintelligibility in any part of what we might call, reasonably, the core identity of the URC. So let me offer you two examples, and I'm glad I'm standing nearer the door than a couple of other people in this room at the moment. And let me offer you two examples to show why I think the answer to that question has to be yes. First, as Tony Tucker discusses in Reformed Ministry, in the Joint Committee working on the Scheme of Union in the late 1960s, the nature of eldership was not clearly explained by Presbyterians in a way that made sense to Congregationalists. For Congregationalists, as I've written somewhere else, ordination was still seen as the public recognition of a call to ministry rather than the human enactment of a divine commission to priesthood. That being the case, what should a Congregationalist understand that it actually meant for elders to be ordained? Was it a diaconal ministry? Presbyterians in the 1960s could not really say. Here we are 50 years later, more than, and we still can't really say, as demonstrated by the reports in Conversations on the Way to Unity back in 2001, and again in 2016 in Unity, Identity and Mission. No surprise then that we ended up with NSM Model 4 in addition to an ordained eldership. The URC has not been able to reach a practically reasoned conclusion as to the underlying nature of eldership. We can say what elders do, but we cannot say what they are. You can feel hackles rising, so I'm going to plunge bravely on, make them rising even further. Baptism. As David Cornick reminded the ministers gathering at Yarnfield last month for the URC, it is totemic, sort of badge of our ecclesiology, that we have reconciled in one denomination strongly held positions on infants and believers' baptism. So perhaps that is an example, as I think I may correctly recall David Thompson as having said, forgive me if I'm wrong on this, an example of how the URC doesn't need to make sense. It's above making sense because we are united in the Spirit beyond the reach and dictates of merely human reasoning. Well, with apologies to both Davids, to say that my reading is of a much more nuanced reality. We've already heard how Congregationalism carried with it into the URC in its own tradition, something which embraced not only infant and believers' baptism, but also, you mentioned the Baptist and by extension, the Anabaptist branch of independency, which dates back at least into the 17th century and perhaps earlier. And that amalgam of practices made perfect sense to Congregationalists, because they saw it as the business of each individual believer to work out in the context of their immediate Christian fellowship, in the context of that fellowship, the point at which baptism was an appropriate expression of discipleship, whether for their infant children or for themselves as converts. No problem so far, you might say. Yet that Anabaptist strain persists to the present day in the life of the URC. Witness the 90-year-old baptised at Kingston upon Thames in the early 2000s after nearly 70 years of faithful church membership. Witness the 20 or more, I think it's more, delegates at the Loughborough General Assembly who rose as one to object to a statement from the platform that baptism was a prerequisite for service and ordination as an elder. Well, it's the wrong way around, ordination and service as an elder. One after another standing up and saying, I'm an elder, I haven't been baptised. And I. From the look which I can still see in my mind's eye of stunned disbelief on the faces of the platform party at Loughborough, I would say that the presence, even the existence of unbaptised elders simply did not make sense to them. They, the leaders and doctrinal experts of the URC, had an understanding of the proper ordering of the church which had assumed a state of affairs that did not correspond fully to the underlying reality. So I would adduce those two examples, the ordination of elders and baptismal practice, as evidence in the present day life of the URC that we cannot make all of our practices and traditions wholly intelligible even to ourselves. Now, both of these examples are, in the jargon of the age, so to speak, baked in to the life of our denomination. I don't know about you, but almost all of the time, I just get on with what I do in the URC without fretting about the nature of eldership or baptismal theology. Maybe it's just me, but if you are anything like me, it is the case that it would be reasonable, given we just sort of float over these things, it would be reasonable to step back and ask just how much else might be baked into the URC like that without actually really being intelligible. Back in the pre-1972 world, when the Joint Committee was at work, none of those involved, David will correct me if I'm wrong, but none of those involved would have thought about their task in terms of McIntyre's categories of tradition and narrative. And the language was of union rather than merger most of the time, which I think merger probably sounded a little bit too much like sort of mergers and acquisitions and big business and things. So union was definitely the language. And the reasonably clearly articulated aim to incorporate in the new denomination the best of both uniting traditions. What's wrong with that? It sounds laudable. Surely that must have been what the obvious thing to do was. But the problem with that approach, as the example of eldership has already illustrated, is that there was no benchmark for deciding what would actually be best for the united church. Congregationalists and Presbyterians came to the ecumenical feast bearing gifts that each party insisted the other should accept, so that the ingredients, in effect, decided to a significant extent what the recipe was going to be. Now, I'm not a great cook, and you do sometimes find that you've got things in the cupboard and you have to make a meal out of it. There's nothing else. But I put it to you that that's not where you start from if you're trying to prepare a dinner party. Daniel Jenkins, different Daniel Jenkins, a keen ecumenist, reflected soberly on the final scheme of union and on the union itself back in 1972, saying that, and I quote, "the significance of the event of union may indeed lie more in the realm of psychology than of theology. No new theological insight and no fresh understanding of the principles of church order seems to have been granted to those who negotiated the union." I'm going to say that again. No new theological insight and no fresh understanding of the principles of church order seems to have been granted to those who negotiated the union. And that is a contemporary view from a man who was wholeheartedly in favour of trying to bring this union about. We know, we've been told, but we know anyway, that the hope, if not the expectation, when the URC was brought into being, that it would be short-lived, provisional dispensation that would be swept away in a greater transition from division into unity within the universal church and indeed between nations. And this underlying presumption of provisionality, I'm sure, contributed to the relative ease. David's already given a sort of nod in this direction, contributed to the relative ease with which the doctrinal and structural frameworks for the new denomination were established. With a greater vision of unity before them, it would appear that it didn't seem to matter too much to the Joint Committee if the recipe was indeed being defined by the ingredients. Nevertheless, as Martin Cressy and others subsequently observed, the senior clergy who had led the two churches into the Union of 1972, and again David's already alluded to this, were under no illusions that they'd actually achieved a complete and wholly satisfactory resolution of all of the substantial provisions which had led Presbyterianism and independency to go their separate ways hundreds of years earlier. Arthur MacArthur, first General Secretary of the URC, as well as the last of the Presbyterian Church of England, and obviously a key figure in the URC's creation, wrote this in the foreword to Kenneth Slack's small book on the United Reformed Church, published in 1978. "If the new church can resolve the living tensions that it has inherited, it will have profound things to say about unity and about freedom and order in society." And Slack himself, even in what is otherwise, I have to say, largely pretty much a puff piece about the forthcoming union in the Journal of Ecumenical Studies in 1972, even Kenneth Slack did not disguise the fact that there had been significant strains and stresses in the negotiations on the way to that unity. The Presbyterian fears, he wrote, have largely centred upon the provincial moderatorship. Congregational doubts have tended to concentrate upon the eldership. Now, as we know, both moderatorship and ordained eldership became part of the new mandated structure of the uniting churches. But in each case, their exact nature and their authority were not agreed. As Arthur MacArthur himself acknowledged in relation to elders when he wrote in 1987 that the question of final authority between church meeting and elders meeting was never finally resolved, but left in trust that their spheres of authority would be established by custom. I'm struggling to see the recipe in that, I'm just saying. It's feel the ingredients, but the recipe does seem to have gone AWOL. And Slack reported back in 1972 that the moderators were regarded by many Presbyterians as the insertion of the thin end of episcopacy, and that suspicion was in no way allayed by Trevor Beeson, a senior Anglican observer, expressing a view earlier while the final negotiations were still going on, publishing his opinion that the moderators will be bishops in everything but name. It's nice to know who's trying to help you in these things, isn't it? In McIntyre's terms, sorry, I had to bring philosophy back in somehow. In McIntyre's terms, there was a disjuncture, cutting off in the living traditions, which, as I said, look backwards, forwards, and are contextualised in the present. There was a disjuncture, a cutting off in those living traditions and narratives of the uniting churches. And that can be seen most clearly in the way in which the structures, that's not putting it too strongly, of Congregationalism and the structures of English Presbyterianism were brought together. So I'm going to spend the closing minutes of my time talking through a graphic representation of the formation of the URC in 1972 and its antecedent churches, with some apology due to those of you who've encountered this before in my PhD thesis. I don't know how many of you that is, because apart from the library copies here at Westminster, my own lending copy, which looks remarkably like this, but is clearly marked in red letters on the front, please return to My own lending copy embarked on an odyssey around the URC about 10 years ago, and has yet to find its way back. And if you know where it is, get somebody else to tell me. You know where it is.
No, I'm just asking, is it clear return?
Yes.
It's to go to you rather than the person who got it.
It says, please return to Romilly Micklem. And although there was another Romilly Micklem, the only way you're going to return it to him is by having some sort of transcendental experience. Anyway, I do know that a couple of you have seen these before, and I know that Stephen's seen them before because he corrected them with me. So I hope you can see that. What you've got is a schematic representation of the defined structures of the Presbyterian Church of England in 1972, with the General Assembly at the top and authority flowing down through the presbytery and the elders' meeting and into local congregations. I'm not going to walk over to the other side to repeat the experience, but I hope it's clear enough. And going up on the other side, in order to serve on these councils, ordination was normally a prerequisite, either as an elder or as a minister of word and sacraments. So conciliar ecclesial authority flowed through that hierarchical structure. And that structure embodied the propositions we've already been thinking about earlier, that Presbyterianism was constituted as a national church and that it had no problem with the principal establishment. So the congregational church in England and Wales looked very different. It's debatable whether it even really considered itself to have a church structure beyond the church meeting. Though it obviously had these other bodies, but then you can see district associations, county unions, deacons' meetings, it had other bodies through which it worked in various ways. The church meeting was the true assembly of the church, understood as the place where God's word spoke to the people through Scripture, read and expounded under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. In this sense, its authority derived directly from its function as the seat of teaching and exegesis. And that was in each local gathering of Christ's people. Now, Michael Hopkins and others here are far, far better placed than I am to comment on this, but nothing that I've encountered in my reading suggests that English Congregationalism had any concept of a council of the church within its polity. other than the meeting of the local congregation. He's nodding. And that's even after the union became the church. So insofar as it could be said to have a structure, the Congregational Church in England and Wales had a form which embodied the primacy of the local congregation and which reflected a deep-seated resistance to the very idea of establishment and any church authority that did not directly derive from the church meeting. Matching up Presbyterian and Congregationalist churches in terms of their authority structures, authority flowing down the screen, did not straightforwardly create anything approaching an intelligible picture. This slide originated in my PhD thesis, and I confess that when I was preparing this talk, I did wonder about redrawing it with a grey elephant instead of that amorphous blob in the middle being the elephant in the room. How could it make sense? How could it be intelligible to bring together two denominations which, despite their shared non-conformity, reluctant or otherwise, had such completely different fundamental understandings of the nature of the church? There were quite simply no points of correspondence in any schema which reflected the alignment of ecclesial authority. And that is what that picture tells you, certainly tells it to me. So what happened? I need to be absolutely clear that this figure is not in any way intended to represent a conscious move or intention or action by the Joint Committee or indeed anyone else in the CCEW. As far as I can tell, no one set out an inverted view of the flow of Congregationalist ecclesial authority into this sort of bottom-up picture. I'm not going to ask you what it reminds you of, because you can see immediately just how much more like the structure of the URC it looks, even though the role, function and authority of none of the bodies on it has been changed. So I think this schematic does capture something of the shift in mindset of those Congregationalists leading the CCEW towards the Union of 1972, even if they themselves were largely unconscious of the seismic upheaval that they were actually envisaging. So once the questions of eldership and moderatorship had been incorporated into the scheme of union, even if not exactly completely settled, and provincial synod meetings created, not so much perhaps to give moderators something to do as to ensure that there was a council of the church to which they should be answerable. The Joint Committee arrived at the 1972 structure, which we, I think, will all recognise, now of course significantly changed and no longer uniform across the denomination. I spent a slightly less than happy hour, purely out of interest, to see whether it could be done, trying to draw a schematic along these lines to capture the diversity of the Southern Synod. It might be possible, I suppose, certainly beyond me, and I would challenge anyone to get it onto one page of A4. So, for Presbyterians, it was pretty straightforward to read across from the old Presbyterian Church of England conciliar structure to the new URC structure of councils. And from a Presbyterian perspective, it's a hierarchy of councils. Presbyterians may not have been too sure what the church meeting was really for. Witness the perplexity of Presbyterian ministers from overseas coming to serve in the URC. I when they encounter a church meeting for the first time, possibly second, third, and fourth times. And Presbyterians may indeed have scratched their heads slightly over the need to have two layers of council between the elders' meeting and the General Assembly, but we fixed that once, so that's fine. But it was recognisably a Presbyterian model of church governance that was adopted when the URC was formed. Congregationalists, the URC's structure was only intelligible because they held on to the assurance that the church meeting of every congregation was the only body with final authority over that fellowship. Even so, they struggled to make sense of the new denomination structures. I'll try not to do this, but this is too relevant not to quote it. This is from Tony Tucker again, with his usual elegant understatement. He says this about congregations and new structures. Former Presbyterians were better prepared for life in the new church than their former Congregationalist partners. They, the Presbyterians, brought to the new church their long experience of living and working in a conciliar church. This proved a better preparation for life in a church, united and reformed, than the Congregationalist experience, which had almost entirely focused on the local church. Former Congregationalists were surprised at early meetings of district councils and synods by the reliance the officers of these councils placed on the manual as a prescriptive guide for the ordering of the church. The Congregationalists brought to the new church a rich tradition of local church order centred upon the church meeting. While they valued the diaconate and local congregations looked to their deacons for leadership and example, the diaconate had not been regarded as a court of the church or as having any authority over the members of the congregation who had elected them. Notwithstanding the recent transformation of the Congregational Union of England and Wales into the Congregational Church in England and Wales, County Union, provinces and even the National Assembly have remained subordinate in importance to the local church. The United Reformed Church, says Tucker, was to offer a steep learning curve to its former Congregationalist members. So my earlier schematic, the one which might have had an elephant in it rather than that amorphous blob, showed from the point of view of the flow of ecclesial authority the incommensurability of the Presbyterian Church of England and the Congregational Church in England and Wales. And the path to the formation of the URC in 1972 did not resolve that fundamental incommensurability. Instead, the Congregationalist model was, in a sense, name-checked onto the recognisably Presbyterian new multi-layered conciliar structure. Yes, we've got an assembly, right, tick. We've got a church meeting, tick. You've got provincial moderator, we'll have a provincial synod, tick. The late Peter Mackintosh, during his term as moderator of General Assembly, said to a group of ordinands from the Southern Synod in 1999 that it seemed to him that the formation of the URC had been a stitch-up job. Congregationalists were, he said, told that the higher councils and the imposition of the eldership were just a bit of window dressing to please the Presbyterians. In reality, nothing would change for the Congregationalists. But, said Mackintosh, Presbyterians were told the church meeting was just a talking shop, and the real power in the URC would lie in the elders' meeting and the higher councils imported from Presbyterianism. In reality, Presbyterians too, nothing would change. One might well wonder whether if nothing was going to change for either party, the marriage should take place. Yet something fundamental did change. We lost, somewhere along the way, not only the locus, but also a shared understanding of the source and nature of ecclesial authority. And that, I suggest, was the consequence of a rupture in the traditions and narratives of the antecedent denominations to the Union 50 years ago. Our self-understanding today, I further suggest, is that we are a church, understand ourselves to be a church, on a journey still of ecumenical evolution. But this evening I've argued that that self-understanding does not pass the test of practical reasoning. So no,